Welcome to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters. I'm Michonne Boston.
And I'm Tequina Boston.
We're your hosts and real-life sisters who binge on historical drama.
We'll talk about films, fictional adaptations, and dramatic series as windows to the past and mirrors of the present.
So fill your teacup or mug with your favorite sip as we explore what's fact, what's fiction, and the so what on historical drama with the Boston Sisters. I'm Michonne Boston.
And I'm Tequina Boston. Welcome to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, where we talk about historical films and dramatic series as windows to the past and mirrors of the present. Listen to past episodes and sign up for our newsletter on our webpage at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters to stay up to date on new episodes and bonus content.
We've come to episode 39 of our podcast with a conversation with Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and journalist Kai Bird about the Christopher Nolan feature film Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer is based on the 2005 book American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer, co-authored by Kai Bird with the late Martin J. Sherwin. In addition to receiving the Pulitzer Prize, American Prometheus also won the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Duff Cooper Prize for History.
The film Oppenheimer is written and directed by Christopher Nolan and features Cillian Murphy as J. Robert Oppenheimer, Emily Blunt as his wife, biologist and botanist Catherine Kitty Oppenheimer, Matt Damon as General Leslie Groves Jr., Robert Downey Jr. as Louis Strauss, Florence Pugh as psychiatrist Jean Tatlock, Kenneth Branagh as Niels Bohr, Gary Oldman as President Harry Truman, and many more acclaimed actors in the cast. The film traces J. Robert Oppenheimer's life from his days as a student physicist in Europe to his academic career in the U.S. and into World War II and the Cold War. Oppenheimer's social life and friendships are a mixture of academia, science, politics, and seduction. Some of his associations haunt him in later years. Oppenheimer is sought out by the U.S. government, represented by General Leslie Groves Jr., to lead the secret Manhattan Project to create an atomic bomb. For Oppenheimer, it's a critical race against the enemy, Nazi Germany, which has the scientific knowledge to build the bomb. The U.S. military acquired the site of the Los Alamos Ranch School for Boys in New Mexico to build laboratories and housing for scientists, military personnel, other team members, and their families. The bomb is tested at the secret Trinity Test site and is a success. But Germany is no longer a threat after Adolf Hitler's death, and terms of surrender become imminent. For the scientists, the atomic bomb triggers a paradox of ending the Second World War and ushering in a new era with the capacity to end the world. As the Red Scare escalates into McCarthyism, Oppenheimer's past associations with American communists in his academic and social circles embolden adversaries like Louis Strauss, chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, to destroy Oppenheimer's credibility and influence. Oppenheimer is questioned about his loyalty to the United States. The political hit job, led by Louis Strauss, crushes Oppenheimer's ability to inform and participate in policy decisions related to the future of U.S. atomic science and weapons.
In addition to American Prometheus, Kai Bird has written critically acclaimed and award-winning biographies, including The Color of Truth, McGeorge Bundy and William Bundy, Brothers in Arms, that focuses on Cold War policies that extended through the war in Vietnam, The Good Spy, The Life and Death of Roy Ames, and most recently, The Outlier, The Unfinished Presidency of Jimmy Carter. Kai's memoir, Crossing Mandelbaum Gate, Coming of Age Between the Arabs and Israelis, was a finalist for both the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Kai Bird has produced critical writings on the Vietnam War, Hiroshima, nuclear weapons, the Cold War, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the CIA. His current project is a biography of Roy Cohn, an American prosecutor and lawyer who served as chief counsel to Senator Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy was a Wisconsin Republican most recognized for his interrogations of alleged communists during the Cold War period in the United States, also known as the Red Scare. Kai Bird is an elected member of the prestigious Society of American Historians. Welcome, Kai, to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters.
Well, thank you, Boston Sisters, for having me. That was a very loquacious introduction.
You've done tremendous things.
Well, big film, big film. What was your reaction after seeing the Oppenheimer film? And why do you think it's gaining so much public attention?
Yes, well, I was stunned by the film. Nolan did allow me to read the script before he started filming, and I thought it was a tremendous script. But a script or a book, it's a very different thing from the film, and he has transformed it into something very special. I think it's a tremendous film. And when I've seen it 5 times now, and each time
Wow.
I see layers that I missed, little episodes, little anecdotes that just flew by me. It's 3 hours, but it moves very fast and cuts back and forth between color and black and white. And I mean, it's a visually splendid film. When I first saw it, Nolan escorted me into an IMAX theater in Hollywood at 10 a.m. in the morning, and it was completely empty. And he sat me down in the middle of the cinema hall. And then he adjourned with his wife, Emma, who's his producer, to the end of the row to give me a little privacy. And I sat there watching it alone for 3 hours. And I was just stunned. It was very moving. I at one point found myself weeping a little bit at the heaviness of the story, and weeping for the fact that my co-author Marty Sherwin was no longer with us to see this splendid film based on American Prometheus. Anyway, so obviously I liked the film.
But we liked it a whole lot too. The folks who watch historical films and dramatic series that we've encountered through this podcast often like to know what is fact and what is fiction. We found that it inspires even our own curiosity to find out what's the real history behind the stories that are put on the screen. So, are there particular facts in the film you think audiences should pay particular attention to as they're watching it?
Well, again, I'm a biographer, and this book took 25 years to write with Marty, and it's deeply both the film and the book are deeply biographical about the man, his childhood, his politics, his love life, his what happened to him in the 1954 trial, but also the building of the atomic bomb. He's a very complicated character, and Nolan manages to tell the visual story in a way that is very faithful to the book. There are some there are many pieces of the narrative in the film that come straight out of the book, straight out of the testimony at the trial, that are straight out of the anecdotes that we relate in the book about his early life. But of course, it's a film, and there are imagined conversations, for instance, between Oppenheimer and Albert Einstein, which are imagined. There, you won't find those conversations in American Prometheus, but they're not, they're not improbable. They could have taken place. Oppenheimer and Einstein were friends and colleagues, and Oppie was, as he was known by his nickname, Oppie was actually Einstein's boss, technically speaking, at Princeton, at the Institute for Advanced Study. There are little. I didn't find any errors. Now, I'm sure there are other historians who may quibble with this emphasis or that, and but Marty and I wrote our narrative, and it's our take, and Nolan has done a film which really is authentically faithful to the book.
One thing I did notice, I read in your book the description of the Trinity Test, and he captured that exactly the way it was written in American Prometheus. And in fact, that was the first time I've ever read a description of what that looked like, what was heard, what was not heard, the silence before and what was seen. So,
the movie, that's a very powerful scene where you see the explosion and then suddenly there's silence for many long seconds before you hear and feel the actual explosion, because it takes miles to travel the sound.
Well, also speaking of the book, it was a best-selling book and won a Pulitzer Prize. And after the film's release, I was and still am probably pretty much at the same place, the 149th library patron on the DC Public Library's waiting list to read the book. So what's been the impact of the film on the book, American Prometheus?
Well, when the book came out 18 years ago, that's a long time ago. It got reviewed widely, very favorably, and it sold moderately. It did not actually get on the New York Times bestseller list. It's a 720-page book. It's a heavy biography packed with a lot of history. It reads, people tell me that it reads very much like a novel at times, but it is a long, very deeply complicated and detailed biography, and it did not get on any bestseller list at the time. But then a year later, it won the Pulitzer Prize, and that helped it to find a new and long-lasting audience. It's been in print ever since. But when the film came out, it shot up out of nowhere to number one on the New York Times bestseller list. And sat there for 6 or 7 weeks, and I think it's now fallen to number 3.
Oh, shucks.
Wow.
What got you interested in joining Martin J. Sherwin in this project of writing the biography of J. Robert Oppenheimer?
Yeah, and giving 25 years of your life to it.
Well, I only spent 5 years of my life on this book. Marty spent 25. Marty signed a contract in 1980 with Knopf to do Oppenheimer's life. And, he was a history professor for many years at Tufts University in Boston. And he was a very charismatic, popular teacher. He loved teaching. But he spent years researching and going to all sorts of archives, and he did more than 150 interviews, all neatly typed up in transcripts. But he never started to write. he sort of got biographer's disease, which is convince yourself that there's one more archive to go to and at least a dozen more interviews to be done before you can start writing. And the years roll by and you can't get you don't dare put pen to paper. Anyway, he came to me in the year 2000, 20 years into the project, and actually in 1999 he came to me and asked if I would consider joining him on the biography. And I said no. I said, no, I'm sorry, Marty. I like you too much to do that. And what I meant was that, writing a biography is hard enough. Co-authorship is often fraught with difficulties and egos. And anyway, I told Marty that I liked him too much to engage in co-authorship. That it was, co-authorship was filled with perils. Um, Anyway, he didn't take no for an answer, and he kept coming down to Washington where I was, and he'd take me out to dinner. And more important, he took my wife Susan out to dinner. He realized he had to woo her, and he was a very funny guy. Anyway, he at one point he said, if you don't join me on this project, my gravestone is going to read, "He took it with him." And Susan realized that he was a very decent guy and funny, and I was unemployed, of course. I was in between projects. I'd finished my biography of the Bundys, and it had come out in '98. And anyway, Susan thought for a time that she wanted me to get a, quote, a real job.
Okay.
But a real job didn't manifest itself. And here Marty was asking me to join him on his project. And so eventually I said yes. And, it was terrific. It turned into a great collaboration. Marty had done all this research. He was very excited to have someone come aboard. I started to write the early chapter on the childhood, and that stimulated him to start writing. And we went back and forth. And every few weeks, he would call me from Boston, very excited to say that he'd found one more box of archival documents in his closet or in the attic
Oh boy.
Oh, no. I mean, good, but
he'd forgotten about. And it was so. There was plenty of research. I didn't really have to do much research, but it still took us 4.5, almost 5 years to write and publish the book. And anyway, we had a lot of fun doing it. And as I said, I'm just regretting that he's no longer around with us. He died in 2021, just 2 weeks after learning that Christopher Nolan had signed on to be the director and screenwriter of the film. And Marty was 84 years old, and he succumbed to small cell lung cancer.
Hmm. Yeah.
yeah, I'm glad we have this opportunity to talk about his contributions to this enormous biography. Um, I also want to ask you, when you entered the project, what opinion did you have of J. Robert Oppenheimer? And did that change after you completed this project, or was it altered in any way?
Well, sure. You spend 5 years looking at another person's life. You really learn a lot. I'd known quite a bit about Oppenheimer. I'd written a little bit about him in my previous books because he was good friends with John McCloy and McGeorge Bundy, whom I'd written biographies of. So I had to write about Oppenheimer a little bit in both of those books. But, the research that Marty had gathered gave us an opportunity to do a really in-depth, rounded portrait of a guy who is often very mysterious. For instance, both the book and the film deal in the beginning with something called the poison apple incident. And we're not quite sure what happened, but at the age of 22, when he was in Cambridge, England, studying quantum physics and trying to be an experimental laboratory physicist, he suddenly felt he was failing. He was awkward in the laboratory. He kept breaking things with his hands, and he just wasn't a very good experimental physicist. And so for the first time in his life, he was facing, quote, failure. And this precipitated a crisis of some sort, an emotional crisis. He plunged into a deep depression, and something happened in that period. It's described as poisoning his tutor's apple. We're not quite sure it was whether he was actually attempting murder or whether that was a metaphor for something else. But something happened that caused him to be nearly expelled from Cambridge, and his parents intervened and negotiated with the university authorities and promised that they would take him to a psychologist, which they did. And so he had a nervous breakdown that is mysterious and yet important. And in the film, it's an opportunity to show his vulnerability, the fragileness of his personality, and to make him human, not just an historical icon, but someone who, as a young man, grappled with his social awkwardness, his awkwardness around women, and the fact that he just was not very good in the laboratory, was not good with math, but he then, in the process, he overcame this crisis, discovered theoretical physics, the new physics, the quantum physics, and that was something that he was very adept at. He could hear the music, uh, as they say, and he got his PhD in a year and came back to America and started the country's essentially first quantum physics department at Berkeley, California, in the late 20s.
Kai, in a conversation with Walter Isaacson for Amanpour and Company, you lifted up that Robert Oppenheimer had a gift for synthesizing complex science and making it understandable to lay people. What did you, as a historian and journalist, have to do in order to understand and immerse yourself in the world of those early and mid 20th century physicists to interpret that science for non scientists and readers of American Prometheus?
Well, let me tell you, it was difficult. Understanding quantum is an arduous task, and I can't say that I understand it even today. Um, in college, I'm the guy who took one course in physics. It was called Physics for Poets.
Where is that?
That's the course I want to take.
It was, sort of dumbed down physics for English and history majors who were
That's
who were
me.
fulfilling their science requirement, right?
Right.
Um, no, it was hard to describe and in writing and plain English what Oppenheimer was studying in the late 20s and 30s in terms of quantum. But we would study the papers he wrote and read a lot of books about quantum physics and the history of it. But it was difficult. And I think he in particular, though, you ask what made him special as a quantum physicist. And actually, it was that he was, in fact, a polymath. He wasn't just a nerdy scientist. He expressed an interest in all sorts of things, from English poetry. He loved T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. He loved the novels of Ernest Hemingway. He was interested in psychology and history and eventually politics. And he also acquired an interest in reading the Hindu scriptures, the Bhagavad Gita, and so much so that he made a point of learning Sanskrit enough so that he could read the Gita in the original. So this is, a young man in his 20s and 30s who's a polymath and deeply interested in all things human. And he's interested in figuring out this rare science and the physical world that quantum can expose us to, the world of the small, the world of the tiny, that is, doesn't actually, quantum mechanics sort of describes nature as absurd from the point of view of common sense. But it actually fully complies with experimental results. So it's true. So you have to accept the notion that common sense sometimes doesn't explain our physical world and that nature is absurd. And Oppenheimer could sort of see this, and he could explain it in plain English to people like General Leslie Groves, who came knocking one day at his laboratory door in Berkeley, seeking to interview people who might be candidates to lead the scientific secret city that they were building, that they envisioned. And Oppenheimer was then 38 years old, and yet Groves could see that he was very ambitious, very bright, quick, and there was a spark of charisma in him. But he could also explain things in plain English to Groves, who was himself, a gruff conservative army general, or actually a colonel at the time. But Groves was also a trained engineer. And improbably, these two men who were complete opposites in many ways, nevertheless grew a bond of friendship and trust, and it became a partnership that was, explains the success at Los Alamos.
You've been enjoying Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, a podcast where we talk about historical drama series and films as windows to the past and mirrors of the present.
Visit our webpage at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters. Share this podcast. Join our historical drama community by signing up for our newsletter to stay up to date on future episodes and bonus content.
Now, back to our podcast conversation. Like you said, being a polymath, as you called him, it sounds like Oppenheimer was something of a humanist scientist. And I was really interested in how the New York school he attended, the Ethical Culture School, because everybody has kind of like a formation story. How might his attendance at that school have shaped him as a scientist, but also as a person with sort of a social conscience and a humanist approach to science.
Yes. Well, the ethical culture school still exists. It's called the Fieldston School, and here in New York City. But it was founded at the turn of the century by the Ethical Culture Society, and it was sort of a break-off from Reform Judaism, and not a religion, but exactly what it called itself. It was a society for ethical culture. It was sort of a secular religion. And the school they founded, taught humanist, secular, ethical values. And they emphasized philosophy, but also the sciences, and the notion that, human beings can learn to act ethically, collectively, and that human values implied community and solving problems and paying attention to poverty and race. And so, the Ethical Culture School produced dozens of activists, progressive political activists who wanted to solve problems in turn of the century America. And so Oppenheimer was exposed very much to these values philosophically, but he didn't, as a result, he didn't actually think of himself as Jewish. He was of Jewish ancestry. Both his parents were of German ancestry, and his father was actually an immigrant from Germany. But he had made a small fortune by the turn of the century when Oppenheimer was born in 1904. And they raised him in this ethical culture society in the school, and it was a very much a formative experience. And Marty and I spend a lot of time writing about this in the book. The film does not do this. The film doesn't cover his childhood or the ethical culture school, but you can't cover everything in even a 3-hour film.
Yeah, that's why we like dramatic series.
Yeah,
Gives
we
you
like
a little
the
more breadth.
series.
Yeah. Your book describes the Danish physicist Niels Bohr as God and Robert Oppenheimer as his prophet. Explain that and how Bohr's ethical questions about Trinity may have influenced Oppenheimer's perspective after the project and the dropping of the atomic bomb.
Oh, well, people referred to Niels Bohr as the god of quantum physics. And he was a more senior physicist from Denmark. Oppenheimer comes along, and he's, the young, articulate prophet who can explain the physics in plain English as such, and becomes, after Hiroshima and the end of World War II, he becomes America's most famous scientist. Niels Bohr, was smuggled out of Denmark during World War II, and he actually lands they bring him to Los Alamos on the last day of 1943. And he gets off the plane and he is greeted by Oppenheimer, and he has one question for Oppenheimer. He says, "Robert, is it big enough?" And what he meant was, he understood fully what they were doing. Any physicist in the world by 1939 knew that fission had happened, could be made to happen, and that therefore it was theoretically possible to build an atomic bomb. And Bohr's question was, is it big enough to end all war? Is it going to not just end this war, but is it potentially going to be seen as such a terrible weapon that human beings will understand that they could never again engage in world war? And Oppenheimer took this argument to heart and actually used this argument that Bohr had given him in the spring of 1945 when there was a meeting convened of his scientists, physicists, and chemists and engineers in the spring of 45. Everyone knew that Germany was defeated. So why are we working so hard to produce this weapon of mass destruction if the Germans and the threat of Nazi fascism triumphing with an atomic bomb is no longer possible? Yes, the Japanese were fighting on, but no one believed the Japanese had the capability of doing this. They weren't in the race as such. And there was actually a public meeting inside the barbed wire secret city at Los Alamos where these issues were discussed. And Oppenheimer stood at the back of the room and listened to people argue. And then at the end, near the end of the meeting, he stepped forward and he made the argument that Niels Bohr had given him, that we have to demonstrate this weapon, demonstrate that it is big enough to end all war, that it is such a terrible weapon, and that people will not understand the nature of this weapon. They will not understand that this is not like any other weapon. It's a very, it's a weapon of Armageddon. And if we don't demonstrate this weapon in this war, somehow demonstrate its power, the next war is going to be fought by 2 or 3 adversaries, all of whom would be armed with nuclear weapons, and that would be a very terrible war. That could lead to the end of civilization.
What a huge ethical dilemma.
Yeah, it's a deep ethical dilemma, and I'm not quite sure if I had been there whether I would have been persuaded. But most of the scientists were. Most continued to work. Only one actually. Joseph Rotblat, only one physicist resigned from the project, and that was in late 1944 when Rotblat realized that the war in Europe was going to soon be over, and he left the project. But I think there was only him and maybe a couple of others. Everyone else worked hard to build the gadget, to test it, and they were around to see it used on 2 Japanese cities.
Wow.
One thing that strikes me about the project is that you have 2 different perspectives here. There's the military perspective and the military goals, and then you have the scientist perspective and the scientific goals of the project at Los Alamos. How would you compare and contrast those goals or worldviews, especially between Leslie Groves, and Robert Oppenheimer, and the scientists?
Well, I think Oppenheimer's view was very much, well, I have to build this gadget because I fear the Germans could give it to Hitler. But I want to, as soon as it's demonstrated, and he was most certainly resigned to seeing it demonstrated in combat, and he understood there was no military target large enough, and that therefore the target was going to be a city. So he had resigned himself to this. And in the book, I tell a story which is not in the movie, but I found one of the few interviews I did for the book. Marty did most of them. I found Ann Wilson, who was Oppenheimer's secretary at Los Alamos towards the end of the war. And I discovered that she was still alive and living in Georgetown, not far from my home in Washington, D.C. So I went to interview her, and we had a terrific interview. And at one point, she told me she was walking to work one day in Los Alamos with Oppenheimer, and it was right after Trinity, right after the successful test of the gadget, but before the bomb had been used on Japan. And suddenly she could hear Oppenheimer muttering to himself, "Those poor little people, those poor little people." And she stopped him and said, "Robert, what are you talking about?" And he says, "Well, now we know, from Trinity that the gadget works, and now it's going to be used on a whole city. And most of the victims are going to be innocent civilians, women and children and old men and civilians. Poor little people." And yet, when I told this story, came back and told this story to Marty Sherwin, he pointed out very quickly that this must have been the same week that Oppenheimer had a meeting with some of the bombardiers who were going to be on the airplane and were going to drop the weapon on a city. And he was instructing them at exactly what altitude it should be detonated to have the most maximum destructive power. So that's a complicated man, someone who is carrying out his duty to give the gadget, this terrible weapon, to the politicians who are going to decide exactly how to use it. And at the same time, in the same time period, he could be worrying and thinking and empathizing with the victims. So that was Oppenheimer. I think that story illustrates Oppenheimer's perspective about the bomb. General Groves, by contrast, was simply determined that the $2 billion that he had spent to build these weapons, that it should be demonstrated in combat, and that he wanted to be vindicated in terms of both the money and the time and effort to build this weapon. And he was less concerned and certainly less philosophical about what would happen afterwards, the post-atomic world. But Oppenheimer was very much concerned about the post-atomic world.
Well, one thing, it seems that this project, the Manhattan Project, was going to happen whether Oppenheimer was part of it or not.
Right.
It was already on the on-ramp, as they say.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The choice of Oppenheimer as scientific director probably resulted in the gadget being produced in time for it to be used at the end of World War II. Everyone we interviewed said that at Los Alamos said that if it hadn't been for Oppenheimer, it would have taken much longer.
I want to go back to the war with Japan. And in the film, we don't see what happened with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but the film does show the jubilation in the U.S. after the dropping of the atomic bomb on Japan in 1945 and ending the war. One thing I always talk about on the podcast, what we're taught in school, and then what we get out of these historical dramas, and then reading books like American Prometheus. And, the story we're getting, even from this film and your book, does not match the story that we got in school. And in some ways, it may not even match the story that people are still telling, the narrative that we are still being told. But there was a decision-making process, and I think there were papers available on that. And what was disturbing for me was reading how the strategy included intentionally killing civilians without warning the Japanese government. When you were writing the book or looking at the research, what what were the arguments for and against the United States using the atomic bomb? Because it seems like the film alludes to the fact that Japan was ready to surrender, and your book talks about that as well before the bomb. Were there other options to ending the war with Japan without the bomb?
Right. The short answer is yes, there were other options. Yeah, but most Americans, even to this day, probably believe, if they know anything about the story, they assume that the atomic bomb is what ended World War II and persuaded the Japanese to surrender. But if you read American Prometheus or you see Christopher Nolan's film, you will come away definitely in the book and even in the film with questions about what happened and whether it was actually necessary to use 2 atomic bombs on 2 Japanese cities. At one point in the film, they have Oppenheimer turning to Edward Teller after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he says, well, I've just learned from Henry Stimson, the war secretary, that there was intelligence and that we knew that the Japanese were very close to surrendering when we used these weapons. And indeed, in October of 1945, just 3 months after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Oppenheimer gives a speech in Philadelphia, a public speech, in which he says, well, you may think that these weapons are expensive. They're actually very cheap, even though we spent $2 billion on them. And there are no secrets to these weapons. The physics is known, and any country anywhere in the world, however poor, that wishes to acquire these weapons can do so. And these weapons, then he says this extraordinary thing. He says, these weapons are weapons for aggressors. They're not defensive weapons. They're weapons of terror. And what he means is that they're not military weapons. They're meant to, their only purpose is to terrorize. And then he goes on and he says, and yes, we use these weapons on an already defeated enemy. So specifically, what we know is from Harry Truman's diary in June of 1945, he writes in his own handwriting, and this diary was only discovered in the 1970s by historians, that he had been reading Japanese intercepts of Japanese cable traffic, and specifically a cable that he referred to as the cable from the Jap Emperor asking for peace. What he meant was that he had read a cable that the Japanese emperor had sent to his ambassador in Moscow, instructing him to explain to the Russians that they should intercede with the Americans and explain that they were ready to surrender, but they did need one condition. They needed a promise that the Americans would preserve the Japanese institution of the emperorship and not put the emperor on trial as a war criminal. Well, that was June. Truman refused to change the terms of surrender to make this clarification. And so the war went on a little longer, and then he used 2 weapons on 2 atomic bombs on Japanese cities. And then, even then, it wasn't quite sure that that's what persuaded the Japanese to surrender. What probably was the tipping point, and this is made very clear in our book, is that the Japanese army generals, who were the hardliners, who were refusing to surrender, changed their minds not after the atomic bombings. They changed their minds when the Russians announced that they were invading Manchuria and were going to advance on the Japanese home islands. They feared an occupation by the Bolsheviks. And that's what persuaded them that they had to immediately turn and surrender to the Americans to prevent the Russians from occupying the Japanese home islands. So that's how the war ended. And Oppenheimer himself had no knowledge of any of this intelligence until after the war. But it saddened him, I think, that to understand that perhaps these two Japanese cities needn't have been bombed.
Yeah. It's interesting, too, that subsequent to that time, we're learning that the impacts even of the bomb testing affected people in the surrounding community. There were Navajo communities around Los Alamos. And how did Trinity affect those neighboring communities in New Mexico, and also the people who were there? In fact, in the film, we were looking as they put on sunscreen and sunglasses. We're going, oh my goodness, they have no idea, what the impact of this nuclear testing is. So, what were some of the impacts on those communities that they, subsequently we've learned about?
Yes, well, today we know that Americans were victims of the Trinity Test and suffered health consequences from the radioactive fallout from the test. And this was something that Oppenheimer and the other scientists, they knew it was a possible danger, but they had no idea of the full immediate dangers. They thought that as long as they thought that the radioactive cloud would dissipate, and that there was going to be no need to order an evacuation. And of course, General Groves, it was his decision on how to execute the test at Trinity. And he did not want to order an evacuation because that would be a breach of security. So it was, a very sparsely populated area, but in fact, there were ranchers, down within miles of the test site, and some of these people were exposed. And I think we're now learning 70 years later that there were many more consequences.
Sounds like you have a
You have a
thunderstorm.
thunderstorm.
There we just had a reminder of the Trinity explosion.
Yes, that was pretty timely. One of the outcomes of the film, I think, is that people are also identifying people who were part of the Manhattan Project that were never, that don't appear in the film, that were never talked about before. And for some reason, I get the feeling a lot of people went to their graves and never talked about it at all. But people have been asking, or people have been bringing to the discussion and attention of that women were background players, at least in this film, when in reality there were lots of women scientists working on the project. Do you know any of these women? Any of these women you'd like to bring up or name, and how they were involved in the project?
There were, a handful of women physicists, but not many. It was the 1940s. It was a army-run operation. They built this secret city, Los Alamos, and they allowed the male scientists to bring their wives and children, and built a school and theater and a health facility. And some of the women ended up working as school teachers, or as Kitty Oppenheimer did briefly. Kitty was a professional woman herself. She had a graduate degree in botany and biology, and she ended up working in testing radiation samples, but quickly got bored with the work and quit. But yeah, no, there. I guess I have to say that the film is accurate again in its depiction of the role of women and the lack thereof. I mean, there were Nolan made a point of putting one woman physicist in the room, so to speak. And there were a handful, but there were thousands of professional chemists and physicists and engineers, and probably no more than a score of women. However, I think both in the book, in the biography, and in the film, the role of women in Oppenheimer's life, specifically Kitty, his wife, and Jean Tatlock, his love affair, his initial love affair before he met Kitty. Both of these women are professional women, highly educated. Jean was studying to become a medical doctor and psychiatrist. And as I mentioned, Kitty had a graduate degree herself. And both of these women are portrayed in the film. They have small parts, but they're important parts. And they're portrayed as strong and intelligent and vibrant. And Kitty, in particular, you know, when her husband is put on trial in 1954, he is oddly inept at defending himself. And by contrast, Kitty is a tiger and becomes a very effective advocate for her husband in the trial, combating, disputing the prosecutor's words. And so, yes, that is, I recognize that's a controversial aspect of both the book and the film.
Yeah, Kitty was a force to be reckoned with, and she was unforgiving too.
She was unforgiving.
I love the line when she says vindictive people can be very patient.
Yeah.
That is so true. What do you see as the potential outcomes as more people engage with the film Oppenheimer?
Well, I'd like to think that the film will, of course, encourage people to read American Prometheus, but to argue about the history. And, historians are always arguing about what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And 100 years from now, historians will be again weighing the evidence and trying to argue about whether it was necessary or not. And these are important issues. And I think the film, I hope, it's relevant because it is so relevant to our times today, both in terms of the danger of nuclear weapons. Just look at the war in Ukraine that could become someday the scene of the use of battlefield nuclear weapons, nuclear weapons as such, which I would argue if Putin ever uses them, they won't be military weapons. They will, as Oppenheimer said, they'll be used as weapons of terror. Anyway, so they're relevant. The story of Oppenheimer is relevant for that reason alone, and it should urge, I hope it results in people thinking about ways to contain these weapons, to control them, to ban nuclear weapons, and to create an international regime of controls that would make sure that people are not allowed to build weapons laboratories for atomic weapons. And then the story is also very relevant because of McCarthyism. Oppenheimer becomes, 9 years after he's celebrated as this scientific hero in 1945, 9 years later, he becomes the chief celebrity victim of the McCarthy era. And that is something, too, that we're still living with. I think it's quite evident that you can explain Donald Trump and see the roots of Trump politics in Joe McCarthy. In fact, Joe McCarthy's chief of staff was a young lawyer named Roy Cohn, who later became Donald Trump's personal lawyer. And Roy Cohn taught Trump everything he knew about politics and how to deal with the press and how to never apologize and always to double down. And so McCarthyism is another relevant aspect of the Oppenheimer story. Finally, Oppenheimer's life story is that of a scientist, and we are living in a world drenched with science and technology, and yet, quite clearly, many of our own citizens don't understand science, don't understand the scientific quest or uh, the process of experimental exploration for facts. And we saw this most recently during the pandemic, where public health officials were questioned about their integrity and honesty and their politics. And I think that has happened only in part because what happened to Oppenheimer in 1954 in that secret trial where he was publicly humiliated eventually, that sent a message to all scientists to beware of getting out of your narrow lane of expertise and don't pretend to become a public intellectual. Don't pretend that you can become a scientist and also talk about politics or policy. Well, we're drenched in science and questions about how to use science. Artificial intelligence is now going to revolutionize our economy and our society, and we need scientists to explain to us the choices we face. And yet, there are not many scientific gurus out there who are also public intellectuals and have that kind of standing, and so that makes the story all the more relevant.
Well, Kai, we come to the part in the podcast that we've called the lightning round, where we ask.
That's an irony for today.
Yeah. It's where we ask all our guests questions related to the themes of the podcast and the topic of the particular podcast. So, if you could go back in time, what time would you visit and why?
I don't want to go back in time. I want to figure out my time. I have my life to figure out, and history is a means for doing that. I wrote a book about McGeorge Bundy because he was one of the major architects of the war in Vietnam. And when I was a young man coming out of college, I was threatened with the draft, and I couldn't understand why this war was being prosecuted by smart liberal intellectuals, a former Harvard dean from Boston. And that compelled me to write his biography. Likewise, Oppenheimer, I grew up trying to understand as a young boy why my school teachers in Washington, D.C. were routinely having atomic drills and asking me to get under the desk. And so as an adult, writing about Oppenheimer is a way to try to figure out my world.
Yeah.
I mean, part of the reason why we do this podcast is we're trying to connect the dots to where we are today. And speaking of today in our times, the second question: what 3 items would you put into a time capsule that reflect your life and the times you've lived through?
Oh, well, that's an easy for a biographer to answer. I would put in my books. my memoir, my childhood memoir, Crossing Mandelbaum Gate, and my biography of Oppenheimer, American Prometheus, to explain the atomic era. So that was too easy.
Well, it would be a rich time capsule for sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Kai Bird, for joining us on our podcast, Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters. For our listeners, Oppenheimer, a film by Christopher Nolan, is distributed by Universal Pictures and currently in theaters, including IMAX theaters. American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer by Kai Bird and Martin J. Sherwin, is published by Knopf Doubleday Publishing Group. You can purchase your copy from our affiliate bookstore. Go to the link in the description for this podcast or our website at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters, where you'll find more information and resources related to this and other podcast episodes.
We invite you to share this episode of Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters with someone you know who would enjoy the conversation. Subscribe to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters and enjoy past episodes wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date on future episodes and bonus content. You can write us at podcast@michonnebostongroup.com. Like and share Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters on your social media.
This is Michonne Boston.
And this is Tequina Boston.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, a podcast about historical films and series dramas. Visit our webpage at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters.
Tell us what historical dramas you're watching. Who knows? We may do a show about it. Sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to the podcast, and share it with the people you know who binge on historical drama.
Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters is brought to you by the Michonne Boston Group. The views and opinions expressed on Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters are those of the speakers and do not represent the positions or views of the Michonne Boston Group, its clients, or affiliates. This is Michonne Boston.
And this is Tequina Boston. Thank you for listening.